welcome to the ICCP's public webinar series. This is part of a series of 6 webinars that the ICCP will be delivering to the public.
So my name's Andy Hewitt. Thank you, Nina, for the introduction. The subject I've chosen is selecting the best contract for your project. I've come across many instances where, for the type of project and the way that the employer or client or owner, depending on where you come from in the world, wants to run them, has not been in compatibility with the form of contract that the owner, the employer and the contractor has entered into. I've also worked on even more projects where the employer has taken a standard form of contract and has amended it heavily, and so it's no longer what it says on the tin, and has made such a mess of amending it. It creates so many ambiguities and conflicts that we're almost starting off from the wrong foot. And when we're in a situation like this, there will be contentions, there will be differences of opinions, and that will inevitably lead to claims. One of the things that we preach at the ICCP is not only dealing with claims when they arrive, but claims avoidance. You know, a professional claims person is in a position where he should be able to anticipate where claims come from, where they might come on a project, and try to do what they can to avoid those situations which may lead to a claim. Now, I'm going to, just as by way of a forward, the ICCP is international in nature, so I'm going to use the FIDIC forms of contracts to illustrate this talk. But don't worry if you're not familiar with FIDIC, but if you're using the JCT, the ICE, the NEC, any other forms of contract or suites of contract that are in use or popular in your area, the principles of what I'm going to talk about, even using the FIDIC forms of contract for examples, still remain the same. So what I'm saying here, even good things can be made better. The JCT, FIDIC, the ICE forms of contracts have been around for a long time. Does that mean they should stay the same? Well, no, it doesn't. And by way of illustration, one of my hobbies is cars. I'm a petrol head, and classic cars in particular, and Mercedes classic cars even in more particular. So in 1987, when an edition of the FIDIC forms of contracts was published, the Mercedes SL500 was a great car, as was the FIDIC form of contract. It did 225 kilometers an hour. It did 7.3 seconds at a 0 to 60 time, which is not great these days, 14 miles per gallon, and for entertainment, yay, you had a radio. If we go to 1999, which is when the second edition of the FIDIC forms of contract, we had a different version of the SL500. This was now accelerated 0 to 60 in 6.2 seconds, so it was faster, it returned better fuel economy, and it had a radio with a cassette player. How good is that, eh? So skip forward to 2017, when the latest suite of contracts were published by FIDIC. We've now got a 4.3 seconds, getting on towards twice as quick in acceleration as the 1987 version. It does even more miles to gallon, and we've got MP3 connectivity, so we can listen to all the music on our phone as soon as we step into the car. So we've made a great car over a period of, what, 30 years, much better. So why do things change? Well, in the motor industry and in the construction industry, we learn how to do things better. In our industry, although the construction industry is a little bit slow, the industry does change, and of course technology changes as well. We learn lessons. FIDIC, for example, is constantly looking at arbitral awards, looking at disputes and saying, well, what went wrong on that project? How could it be fixed? How could we improve on our contracts to avoid that sort of thing happening in the future? We have changes in requirements. When I was a young quantity surveyor many years ago, every project I worked on, working for a contractor, was a particular form of contract. It was we had a bill of quantities, which was very, very accurate, by the way, and we did it this way, and it never really changed. Now, the industry has changed. We've got engineer, procure, construct. We've got fast track. We've got employers not really being concerned about the day-to-day running of the project. They just want a facility handing over, ready to operate, so they can start to make a profit from it. We have developed better practices through time. And one of the things with information technology, we've got to be able to do with things faster, better, cheaper. BIM's a great example. Through technology, we can do such fantastic things with, I was going to say AutoCAD, but like BIM, we got better practices. Things didn't work properly. I will give you an example of, in the FIDIC form of contract, the employer was supposed to respond to the contractor's claims within 42 days. They never did. And they never did because there was no recourse by the contractor if the employer, or sorry, the engineer didn't respond within the 42 days. Well, in 2017, FIDIC says if the engineer doesn't respond within 42 days, the response can be taken as a rejection of the claim and the matter can be elevated to a dispute. So that's how FIDIC have fixed things. So let's just have a look at the sort of thing we need to think about when we're selecting our contract. And I'm going back to my favourite subject of cars again. And when we're selecting our car, we're going to go to the showroom and we're going to buy a new car. We need to think about the correct car for our needs. So if we have a big family, we go away a lot, we go on holiday, we need to carry a lot of luggage, something like an estate car or a large SUV might be the thing that we need to think about buying. If we are fairly well provided for in the bank and we like our cars, and this is a car that I would love to own one day, we might go for something exotic like an SLS. If you were a young guy about town, a little 4-door or 2-door hatchback for nipping around London might be the thing. If we are an executive, middle-aged, and we want a nice, comfortable ride, something like a 4-door saloon. Or if we're young and free and we like our performance, maybe a 2-door coupe. Or if we need some off-road capability, a heavy 4x4 might be the sort of thing. This is just cars, but we have a similar thing with selecting the right contract to suit the project and to suit the employer's requirements. And FIDIC have a suite of, there are a couple of other contracts that I've not got here, but basically a suite of 5 contracts. And when we look at our project, look at what we want to achieve, look at how the employer wants to do things, just about every situation can be catered to by the correct selection of one of these contracts. And it's similar with the NEC, the JCT. They don't just have one form of contract, they have a selection of contracts for you to choose from. So what do we need to consider? And I guess we're talking to a lot of consultants out there, and part of our job as consultants, when we're employed by someone who has a project that need building, but the employers to give them the benefit of our experience, and we need to advise them. So in a lot of cases, it's the consultants that will advise the client, the employer, to adopt a certain form of contract. In my experience, many consultants don't make a proper selection. They're happy with, I don't know, the red book, because they've used the red book, it's quite common, they understand it, so they will recommend the red book because it's easy, rather than it's the best thing for the employer's particular project. So I've got to think about the value of the project. We need to think about the complexity of the project. Are we just building a square or rectangular shaped warehouse with a couple of offices, or are we building a museum with lots of technology, or a hospital with lots and lots of MEP services and even more technology? Who has the design responsibility? Is the employer going to employ a specialist designer, and then the contractor is going to build to the employer's design? Is the employer more concerned with having certainty of cost? And by this, I mean the final account, the final contract price will be to the initial contract price at the time of tender, or is the employer concerned about bringing the project in as cheaply as possible? Who will have day-to-day control? Is the employer not really bothered so long as he gets his turnkey facility and it's good to operate, or does he want to be hands-on? Does he want to appoint a subcontractor to administer the contract and to check the quality of the works, etc.? Does the employer want the facility to be maintained and operated on completion, or is he going to take over and do that himself? So let's just have a look at the different forms of contract that FIDIC, or some of the forms of contract that FIDIC have available. And I'm not going to go into the 2017 contracts because they're not in popular use yet. They will come on stream gradually. So we're going to look at the 1999 editions. The Red Book is for building or engineering works designed by the employer or by his representative. So obviously, in many cases, he employs a consultant to do the design. The contractor then constructs the works in accordance with the design provided by the employer. Although there may be some elements, and this is not usually significant elements, that may be designed by the contractor. So it could include something like the final design of the facades, curtain walling, that sort of thing, which often has to be designed by the manufacturer, and different manufacturers have different ways of doing things. So that could be an element to be designed by the contractor. It's remeasurable, which means that the works are measured as they are constructed, generally from the as-built drawings. And this has a lot of advantages in that you can go out to tender even before the project is finally designed on estimated quantities. And the employer has the peace of mind that if there are 10,000 cubic meters of concrete in the job, he will pay the contractor for 10,000 cubic meters of contract, not 10,010 or 9,999, exactly what's provided. The contractor has the comfort that if he provides 10,010 cubic meters of concrete, and that's measured, well, he will be paid for that 10,010. So if the employer decides to change the works or the design comes in later, well, the employer pays for what's constructed and the contractor is happy because he's being paid for what is constructed. Under the Red Book, an engineer is appointed for administrating the contract, and there is a balanced risk allocation between the parties. And I'll come and talk about risk a little bit later. The FIDIC Yellow Book is a departure in that the main difference is it's the contractor's job to both design it and construct it. So in other words, it's a design and build. So the employer provides the requirements. It might be something really, really basic, like I want a pumping station building to pump a gazillion litres of water per day, and it needs to be on that site over there. That's fairly basic requirements. Or it could be very, very detailed requirements where the employer's got specific requirements for his project or his facility. So that the contractor then has to design and build in accordance with those employer's requirements. And one of the things that I see an awful lot is where there hasn't been enough effort put into the employer's requirements, so that when the contractor designs in accordance with his brief from the employer's requirements, and the employer said, well, I didn't want it like that. Or I know I said I wanted a pumping station, but I also wanted a workshop and a car park. And the contractor said, you didn't ask for a workshop and a car park, therefore it's not in the design and it's certainly not in my price. So you can see how important the employer's requirements need to be. It is a lump sum price, so no remeasurement. Obviously, a lump sum is subject to any variation by the employer or claims or any other adjustments that are made in accordance with the contract. And there is an engineer who is responsible for administering the contract. And again, with the yellow book, even though it's design and build, there's still a balanced risk allocation between the employer and the contractor. Now, the FIDIC Silver Book was produced by FIDIC as a reaction to those employers who are possibly a team of people who are investing money in a project, obviously to make a profit. They're not particularly interested in what it looks like. They're only interested in, does it perform? Does it produce what we want it to do? Is it going to be completed on time? And is it going to come back within our budget, because that's the amount of money that we've arranged finance for, or we put it in the pot to produce it. So FIDIC came up with the Silver Book, which is for engineer, procure and construct, or a turnkey project. So the philosophy here is that the employer says, I want a pumping station, I want it to produce a gazillion litres of water per day, don't care what it looks like, so long as it fits on my plot of land. Come back and tell me when it's ready for operation and give me the key. So, as I've said, it's a turnkey provision typically used for process plants, power plants, possibly factories, sometimes infrastructure, and it can be used for other types of development as well. But it says what it says on the tin. It provides a fully equipped facility ready for operation. The advantage here is it does provide the employer with a high degree of certainty of the final price and the time. And here again, the contractor has total responsibility for the design and execution. Again, it's a lump sum price, and there's very little employer involvement, although the employer is responsible for administering the contract. Now, he can do this through, I guess, one of his own employees, or he could appoint a consultant, someone who's familiar with construction, to advise him on these matters. The important thing here is that there's minimal risk allocated to the employer. So basically we're saying, whatever happens, Mr. Contractor, I'm not interested. Don't come back and ask for any more time or any more money. That's fine. The contractor will look at this and the contractor will say, if we've got to deal with all this risk, that comes at a cost. So obviously the price is going to increase. And this is where employers that employ, that's a bad choice of word, that use the Silver Book have to realize that the shifting of the risk onto the contract, onto the contractor, is going to result in a higher price. But many employers would rather pay a premium for having that price and time certainty. And very lastly, not all projects are complicated. So FIDIC have very kindly produced a short form of contract. It is pretty straightforward. It's 10 pages long. And it's designed really to be used for either uncomplicated work of low value or works of a higher value that's a pretty simple and repetitive. So maybe we're building 20 industrial warehouse type buildings on an industrial park. It's doing the same thing 20 times. So it's repetitive works. Generally, the design is provided by the employer, although there could be some elements of contractor design. It has the facility to be either remeasurable, a lump sum, or even cost reimbursable. The employer appoints a representative, again, could be an employee or a consultant for administering the contract, and there is a balanced risk allocation again. So, FIDIC have produced this really nice diagram which gives you the options. So let's just have a little start here. We've got a straightforward project. Well, yes, we could probably go to the Green Book. If it's a project of a more complicated, decide who does the design. If the employer does it, we'll go to the red or pink book. I haven't talked about the pink book, but basically the pink book is a special version of the red book for use by development banks in countries that are, well, developing countries basically. If the employer doesn't want to provide the design, we can generally look at the yellow book. I've not talked about the gold book, but that includes, as well as design and build, it includes an operation period. If the employer's requirements are for a high degree of time and cost certainty, we can look at the silver book. Or if none of these things will apply, and in my experience it's a rare project where none of these things apply, we need to possibly look at adapting one of the FIDIC contracts for specific requirements. So that gives you a bit of an idea by looking at that flow chart. I did say I'd come back and talk about the allocation of risk, and basically we need to think about when we're including clauses within the contract that deal with things that might happen. It's not a certainty, therefore it's a risk. The things we need to consider is which party can best foresee the risk, which party can best control the risk if it does occur, and which party can best bear the risk, either a performance criteria that is not achieved or possibly paying for dealing with the risk, and which party would suffer most if that risk event occurs. So let's just have a look in a little bit more detail. If we have a balanced risk allocation, the risks are managed by the party that's best able to foresee them. So let's just look at unforeseen ground conditions or unforeseen physical conditions. The party best able to foresee the risks is the employer, because it's his ground, it's his land. He can do surveys, geotechnical surveys, etc., to forewarn himself whether we are likely to come across problems in the ground. The risks are controlled by the party best able to do so. So if we do have some unforeseeable ground conditions, who can deal with it? Well, it's the contractor, because he's got the expertise, he's got the equipment, etc., etc. The risks are borne by the party best able to do so. Well, this is where the employer decides that if we don't have any unforeseeable conditions, I won't have to pay a premium if I bear the risk. If I decide that the contractor is going to bear the risk of something that might happen, he's going to price that risk within the price, so I might end up paying for something that won't happen. So the balance of risk becomes equitable. And of course, the main thing is, if the employer accepts the risks, if no risks are encountered, well, there's nothing to pay against it. If you have an unbalanced risk allocation, well, first of all, it's inequitable. It very often leads to contentions and disputes because time and money is involved. It can lead to delays, and it will definitely lead to a higher price. So employers and consultants that go through a balanced risk contract and then try to rebalance it in favour of the employer must realise that every risk that you put onto the contractor and make it more unbalanced will cost the employer more money. And in my experience, consultants make life easy for themselves by saying, oh, we don't have to deal with anything. If anything happens, we don't have to deal with it. It's all the contractor's responsibility. But they fall short of advising the employer by doing this, it's going to cost you more for your project. So we talked about FIDIC and the standard forms of contract, but not all contracts are let, or all projects are let based on a standard form of contract, be it FIDIC or another form of contract. Very often, employers and use their own contracts, either for themselves or for one particular project. And there are many disadvantages to doing this. Very often they're drafted by lawyers that have very limited knowledge of the design and construction process, so they might be legally fine, but if they don't recognise what happens in our industry, they won't be very workable. On the other hand, they could be drafted by construction personnel who actually know what happens in the industry, but they've got little knowledge of how to draft a contract, what are the legal requirements of a contract, and contractual language. So they end up being ambiguous or containing contradictions and just not being very easy contracts to deal with. Could be a project that's a contract that's not suitable for the type of project. We've used a very simple form of bespoke contract for a really complicated and high value project. It's not been tried and tested in real situations. And, you know, the advantage of using a form of contract for one of the professional institutes that have been around for sometimes more than 100 years is that they have been tried and tested over a very long period. Obviously, somebody's got to sit down and draft a bespoke contract from a blank piece of paper, or more often what happens, it ends up being a bits of contract. They cut and paste a bit from this contract and a bit from another contract and a bit from something else. And you end up with, well, quite frankly, a mess, because they're not, all these bitses are not harmonious with one another. So they will contain ambiguities and conflicts. Users of a bespoke contract, you know, the contractor's given this brand new contract, maybe the consultant's the same, they've got no previous experience. And aligned to that, the allocation of the risk is either unclear, or it's unfair, it's inequitable, it's unbalanced. And of course, you can't go on a training course to learn how to deal with a bespoke contract, the same way as you can with such as the ICE, the JCT, the NEC, FIDIC, etc., etc. There are lots of ways that you can become familiar with the international standard forms of contract. Oh, and that sort of snuck up on me a little bit, so that brings me to the end of the presentation. Sorry about that, a little bit of a surprise there. So let me just finish off a little bit and then we'll go to questions. There are details about the ICCP, so you can have a look at us on the website. If you'd like to speak to someone or have any inquiries, you can contact Nina, or if it's membership queries that you have, drop our membership secretary an email at that email address. So I think now when Nina will come back online and pass on any questions that you may have had.
Right, so our first question is from Hamidu, who asks, in a lump sum contract, can an employer or the consultant deduct money for the de-scoping of the work which is coming less than 5% of the contract value?
In principle, all form of building contracts will allow the employer, engineer, architect to issue variation instructions, and these don't always have to be variations which will increase the price. They can often be to omit work. So the employer can omit works and get a saving on his project. Whether he can exceed a certain percentage of the contract value would depend entirely on the particular form of contract and the conditions.
Okay, our next question comes from Kareem, who asks, could you please explain a little bit more detail the differences between turnkey and design and build?
Yes, it's more of a difference in philosophy. Let me give you a bit of an example. Let's say let's think about a production factory. The employer has a plot of land. He wants to start manufacturing, I don't know, tables. He wants to build a factory. He wants to install the machinery and the production facilities to produce 1,000 tables per day or whatever. So long as he produces 1,000 tables a day, the factory fits on the plot of land that it's got, that it costs about this amount of money, and it can start producing by the end of next year, he's happy. That's all he's interested in. So that would be a typical EPC contract. A design and build under the yellow book, for example, this is where the employer wants to be a little bit more involved. He wants to employ an engineer to administer the works, to supervise the work, to check and to verify the design. He wants to have a say in, well, apart from my factory, I need a suite of offices, and I want a boardroom, and I want a managing director's room, and I want carpet in the boardroom and the managing director's room, and I want wallpaper on the walls, and I want oak paneling, and I want gold door handles, and I want really nice bathroom furniture in the executive toilets. And we're getting into a lot more detail here. So this is a hands-on client. Now, he may be hands-on himself, or he may appoint the engineer to be hands-on on his behalf. So there's a lot more detail in there. The allocation of risk on a yellow book is pretty fair. So if we have unforeseeable ground conditions, for example, or unforeseeable physical conditions, the employer will agree to pay the contractor for having to deal with them. And of course, if there aren't any unforeseeable conditions, well, he doesn't have to pay anything because the contractor doesn't have to deal with anything. So it's a difference in philosophy as much as contracts. So as much as the actual details of the contract. So I hope that helps, Kareem.
I'd just like to thank everybody for attending today's session. I hope that you found it valuable and useful. I hope that some of you will consider joining our membership community. We are trying to grow the Institute. We would love to have more members on board and work towards our goal of raising the standards of construction claims practitioners on an international basis.
Thank you, Nina, and thanks for joining us, everybody.